Now that Apothecary Diaries Season 2 has ended, many fans are left wanting more, and for good reason. Despite the story's vibrant and oftentimes funny tone, there persists a lingering darkness beneath nearly every plot that emerges. Some of the funniest moments also are accompanied by some of the bleakest truths. For example, in the episode A Jaunt Around Town, Mama disguises Jinshi and accompanies him throughout the day, creating one of the sillier and more wholesome moments of the show, only then for an almost jarring moment of sadness to slip through, like for instance Mama wishing she could buy food for her father, who lives in poverty after his unfair removal from the palace, or her revealing how her very existence was part of what cost her mother her health and prestige. These moments do well to paint a picture of the setting and the harsh realities many of the characters face. This is certainly proven true with Season 2's overarching plot, which finds its roots in the trauma inflicted at the hands of the previous emperor and the lasting and far-reaching impacts of his actions. Time and time again, Apothecary Diaries is showing us cruel and difficult to confront truths about its characters. But the lines are not cut and dry. The characters are not split up into simple and easy to define antagonists and protagonists. While some are certainly worse than others, no one exists outside shades of gray, and this proves especially true for one of our characters, Jinshi. Before diving deeper into him, there are a few things that are important to note, not just about details confined to this story and its setting, but about how we collectively approach the topics he's so entrenched within. It would be foolish, first off, to not acknowledge that the story and the fandom see Jinshi as a love interest to Mao Mao. Naturally, when we consume stories, we vacillate between recognizing the characters are within a setting different from our own and that they exist within a work of fiction, while still instinctively imposing our modern sensibilities onto these characters. This is why we see people say, I wouldn't want it for myself, but it's different in stories. While others will argue that stories are a reflection of society, and if the mirror that's being held up to us is showing us something negative in nature, then shouldn't we want to acknowledge the ugliness we're shown? Nuance, of course, is what exists between those two ends of the pendulum. Dissecting why characters are the way they are, while also assessing why we feel the way we do about them, is significant. So let's return to Jinshi and ask a few important questions. Why do some of us see Jinshi in such a positive light? Why do some of us find ourselves uncomfortable with his actions? More importantly, why is it that many of us feel both of these things at once, but tell ourselves we have to choose a side? Let's first examine the state of media as we know it currently. Now, more than ever, we are seeing an overwhelming acceptance of genres like romance, fantasy romance, smut, dark romance, and combinations and subgenres of each of these. Where once people had to seek out forums to find more explicit or heavy content, we now find people openly recommending, purchasing, and talking about such things. People used to be made to feel shame about their curiosity towards these sorts of subjects, but now there's a general acceptance, and for some even a celebration, of consuming such content. It doesn't mean it's for everyone, but it's more widely and publicly accepted and enjoyed than it was in the past. That's not to say there isn't pushback. Some question the validity of toxicity in romance and the legitimacy of its place in entertainment. The world contains such horrors already. Why then should we be seeking out portrayals of such horrors for our own enjoyment? It's a discussion that very quickly and understandably becomes heated. The point of today's conversation is not to take a side on this debate, but to point out that this is the landscape Apothecary Diaries has become popular within. Let's put this into context then. When Jinshi is in any way physical with Mao Mao, some people from the former side are likely going to see this as kink or fantasy. They recognize there's aspects to it that aren't appropriate for a modern day relationship, but they like exploring more taboo topics in fiction. And while I'm certainly only presenting one possible takeaway, I think it's fairly safe to say that if you're reading about stories where people are falling in love with their kidnappers, for example, you probably aren't going to bat an eye at a bite on the neck. Some within the latter camp referenced before, however, are going to point out that there are physical and social differences between the characters, and that there is a lack of verbal or even obvious nonverbal consent in certain scenes. They'll also note that to describe such interactions as playful or romantic might perpetuate harmful stereotypes. I point out this landscape because I think it's not just our modern day views on relationships that impact our perceptions of Jinshi, but our views on modern media, especially portrayals of relationships in media that we're bringing to the table as well. It can feel like all of our disagreements about these topics get reduced to whether a character is a red flag or a green flag, and this is no different for Jinshi. I personally don't feel, though, that anything in Apothecary Diaries can so easily be summarized. The story is consistently showing us how all of our characters are part of a flawed society, and thus are in and of themselves flawed. If we don't acknowledge those flaws, we can't then acknowledge the growth that characters have, and how, at large, societies progress over time. On the flip side, if we ask for our characters to be perfect without showing how they came to their more progressive views, then we fail to engage in the practice of introspection. This is not to say that anyone's initial feelings towards Jinshi are invalid. I'm by no means asking for anyone to like or dislike this character, or to find the interactions between him and Mao Mao romantic or problematic. I'm not even trying to convince anyone to feel a certain way about the character. Rather, I'm wanting to examine how the writing of Apothecary Diaries examines complex themes, and more specifically, how it examines complex themes through Jinshi himself. Let us begin then with the evidence we have of this character so far. Note that this is where I'll be going into spoilers for the first 2 seasons of the anime. I've not read beyond this point in the light novels, so nothing after light novel 4 will be touched on today. First, it's important to note what we've seen of Jinshi's character, and by character, I'm specifically referring to who he is as a person, his tendencies, his personality, the environment he grew up within, and the position he currently holds. While not based on one time within history, we can glean through the very patriarchal structure of an emperor ruling and lines of succession occurring through children, specifically the sons that he has with the many concubines, that women and men are not viewed as equals. Beyond that, people's professions, their wealth, and their association with those in power also dictate a class structure. Jinshi, being related to the emperor and being a man, is at the top of this social hierarchy. Ordinarily, it wouldn't be surprising, given the circumstances, for Jinshi to abuse his power and border on being villainous. However, he instead shows time and time again to subvert expectations. These subversions are very intentional, though. We can trace these back to events throughout his life and his place within such events. For example, Jinshi seems to heavily dislike the previous emperor, which, of course, the guy was disgusting. However, it's revealed through the Empress Dowager's backstory that she, along with many other girls, were given over to the emperor as children, not in spite of his proclivities, as Mao Mao might say, but often because of them. People sought to seek power from the emperor, and they used their young daughters to try and attain that. Thus, it's safe to assume that not everyone was disturbed by what the emperor did and how he conducted himself. Where did Jinshi then begin to develop his disgust with him? For one, the current emperor, as is noted throughout the first coordinating light novel and anime season, seems to go against the things his father was known for. Some even wonder if this is why he avoids Lishu. Jinshi does seem to have some form of a relationship with the current emperor, so it stands within reason that being shown open dislike toward the previous emperor from a young age gave him the first window of opportunity to see the flaws of such behavior. Secondly, Jinshi has spent the majority of his life around women. From Anshi to Surin and even Gaoshin's wife, Jinshi had compassionate and loving women who supported and cared for him as he grew into adolescence. After taking on the role of eunuch and overseeing matters concerning the concubines, Jinshi also finds himself in the beginnings of adulthood not only continuing to be surrounded by women, but being very aware of how they've been treated, how their bodies function, and how challenging pregnancy and motherhood can be. He also understands how dangerous of a position the previous emperor put Anshi in when she had a child so young. The story makes note of how her body was too small to bear a child, so her stomach had to be cut into. On a personal level, Jinshi has witnessed women being resilient, kind, intelligent, funny, mischievous, and formidable. He's also seen how women within the society and system he lives within have been mistreated and abused based on the previous emperor's actions. As such, likely because of the reciprocated care he has for the women around him, he feels, as most people would, a desire to protect them, which results in his internal hatred toward the previous emperor. It isn't the only area we see Jinshi go against the norm, and in a similar fashion, we can trace how he might arrive at more progressive views. Take, for instance, his desire for girls to be educated. Though all of us can agree the interests of the previous emperor are easier to be in opposition to, it's almost more astounding that Jinshi would want girls to have the ability to read, write, and be educated. Unlike before, we don't have the current emperor speaking on this topic. We've not been shown any women urging Jinshi to ensure girls are educated. In fact, we're told the exact opposite, that some of the concubines will be insulted by the idea. So why would Jinshi take it upon himself to try and start a school for them? One clue comes from the very first interaction we have between Jinshi and Mao Mao. While trying to determine what's making Gyokyo and Li Hua ill, and their new babies as well, Jinshi is able to recognize that Mao Mao may know more than she's letting on about this topic, as well as her abilities to read and write. Initially, he just sees her as a means to an end, which may sound harsh, but given the end we're talking about is saving 2 women and 2 newborns, it's understandable. However, after realizing Mao Mao can be of further use to him and the rear palace at large, he starts taking more interest in her. Thus, it's possible the origin of Jinshi's desire to have girls educated is seeing how a simple servant girl turned out to be one of the brightest minds in the entire palace. If such intelligence was within one girl, what other possible outcomes could be found by educating other girls? Not even just for the palace, but for their entire nation. Given how much his work involves affairs of the whole country, he would certainly see how useful it would be if the serving girls who left the palace after their contracts were up, like Shaolin, for example, were able to provide more for their families, for the future families they served, for trade, innovation, the economy, so on and so on. Point of these 2 matters being brought up is not to try and pat Jinshi on the back and convince anyone that actually he's in fact a perfect character and that no criticism should ever be launched at him. Rather, the point is to show where the more progressive convictions he holds come from and how he arrives at certain conclusions. When given evidence that something is harming people, he does what he can to mitigate or eliminate the problem altogether. When he observes how certain changes might better people's lives, he does what he can to ensure those changes become commonplace. But what about the parts of his society and even himself that he's never seen as darker? How does one come to the conclusion that something needs to change if they've never even seen it as a problem in the first place? This is where some of the heavier realities of their society and the story at large come into the picture. We saw, and in fact entire clans saw, the consequences of the previous emperor's actions. Said actions had not just immediate impacts on the lives of the young girls preyed upon, but they also had impacts on their children and their children after that. Festering hatred developed toward those in power who never did anything, who turned a blind eye to it, or who looked to profit from it. A true villain would be someone who could see all of those things and either not care, or worse, wish to continue the cycle because they might somehow benefit. A well-done, morally gray character, and even morally gray societies, make changes when they observe harm being done, but they don't always get to the root of where the harm actually lies. For Jinshi, the harm was in the previous emperor being a fool who took advantage of these girls and preyed upon them. The harm for him was not, however, rooted in the power dynamics of their entire society or in the girls being able to fully consent. Jinshi has the power and prestige to prey upon young children as well, but he chooses not to because he sees it as wrong, but he does not make efforts to completely dismantle the entire political structure his nation is built upon. He still upholds the very structures that contribute to an inability for people to say no. This is where many of Jinshi's worst moments come into the picture. He's been surrounded by concubines his entire life. Much of his day-to-day life is rooted in interactions with said concubines. He works to protect them, yes, which lends itself to the idea that he doesn't wish for any bodily harm to come to them, and he does seem to care about their overall comfort. But at no point has the idea of if they want to be with the emperor ever entered the picture. All of this informs his attempts at romantic pursuits with Mao Mao. He seems happy when she's happy. He doesn't want bodily harm to come to her. He seems determined to ensure she's safe. He does not, however, seem exceptionally concerned with getting verbal consent when he chooses to pursue certain acts with her. One of the first more extreme examples of this is when he tries to feed her honey. He thinks of it somewhat as a silly joke, but we as the viewers can see Mao Mao is uncomfortable. It's not until Gyokyo comes into the picture that it seems to dawn on him that what he's doing is inappropriate, and likely more so because of decorum rather than the concept of consent. Later, of course, we have the infamous frog scene. Given this one has a lot more sexual overtones to it, the topic of consent seems especially applicable. A few things to know about this scene. 1. Him and Mao Mao are alone, which is exceptionally rare for them. Jinshi does tend to seem more emboldened when no one else is present, and if I had to guess, I'd assume it's in part because Mao Mao to some degree treats him more like a person than anyone else, something we know he appreciates and even seems attracted to on some level. When they're alone then, it's unsurprising that he would reveal even more of himself to her, and in this scene, he wants to reveal his actual status to her, but since his actual status also involves specific body parts, it results in what has turned into one of the most referenced moments of the story. Additionally, Mao Mao just before had undressed in front of him, touched him when he was in a state of undress, then, given the fact that, a frog fell on her head, she collapsed onto him, and when asked to move her hand from a very sensitive area, she proceeded to do what Mao Mao is wont to do. She investigated further. None of this, mind you, equals consent. We know this, and when things get heated between her and Jinshi, he does specifically say, "Do you want to find out?" He frames the possibility of something happening between them as a question. However, he doesn't really seem to wait for an answer. The reason I noted everything leading up to the asking of the question is to point out context, but also to remind us all that by modern standards, even with all of the setup for that moment, at no point did Mao Mao indicate she wanted something to happen. There isn't a but or however to add to this. That is simply the fact. Jinshi does apologize to her later for his behavior, but once again, as I referenced about the honey scene, it seems less because he was forward with his physical advances and more because his behavior was outside decorum. It seemed more like, "I'm sorry I got carried away," rather than "what I did was wrong because you never gave me consent." The concept of getting carried away makes perfect sense for his character. Gaoshin is often clearing his throat or giving Jinshi looks to indicate when he's not playing the part of the perfect angelic eunuch. His entire life in the palace is a performance, one he's not meant to step outside the bounds of. Part of what intrigues a lot of fans and makes them want to root for the romance between Mao Mao and Jinshi is that we see both of them have opportunities to be their true selves around one another. Jinshi seems to enjoy seeing Mao Mao's adoration for her work, hence why he's always wanting to gift her with rare medicines, and even goes so far as to look the other way towards things she does that are illegal, which are things we know she appreciates. And in turn, she's the only person really who is respectful toward him out of necessity, but not because she's enamored with his appearance. In a setting where Jinshi is objectified constantly, being treated like a human, or in some cases, as the light novel Mao Mao puts it, a slug, is actually a breath of fresh air. So if we know he cares for her, and we know he wants to do right by people in general, why then does having Mao Mao's full consent not seem imperative for him when he pursues her? It doesn't come across like Jinshi wants to hurt Mao Mao or do something that would cause her an immense amount of pain. It's not been in his nature thus far, and to assume such a thing of him feels unwarranted and without evidence. That doesn't change the fact that not getting consent is harmful. It does cause pain. So as this story does, it forces us as viewers and the characters within the story to confront difficult realities, and in this case, one of the hardest ones is this. Why doesn't Jinshi see this as hurtful, and what would it take for him to understand not only the physical power he holds over Mao Mao, but the societal power as well? Starting first with why he doesn't seem to recognize it, the answer lies most likely in, once again, Jinshi's environment. Concubines are to be treated well, but their roles are to acquiesce to the emperor's wishes and produce heirs. If they can't do that, as was the case with Ajuo, they are eventually cast aside. Based on many of the educational materials Mao Mao instructs them from, there does seem to be some effort put into ensuring that there's at least some enjoyment from all parties involved in the attempts at producing heirs, but that's not the same as providing the concubines the freedom to say no, they don't want to, or that they're not really in the mood. It's instead a matter of making the best of the situation they're in, not whether they want to be in the situation at all. Sadly, to summarize this point, Jinshi doesn't seem to recognize this because it's not even really a concept he's ever been introduced to. And given how little personal experience he has, and how few times him and Mao Mao are actually alone together, I don't know that he can grasp something he's never even known exists. If that's the case then, To expand on the question previously posed, what would it take for him to understand the power he holds over Mao Mao? In all other cases of progressive thoughts, Jinshi arrives at them through evidence. If something is proven to cause trouble or even harm, then he wants to rectify the wrongs. So in order for this to be rectified, he'll have to first, more than likely, realize that how he's treating Mao Mao is hurting her. Maybe not physically, or maybe perhaps physically, depending on the circumstances, but in some manner, he'll have to see what he's doing as having a negative impact before correcting it. Some might argue that Mao Mao could easily just tell him. In the case of the frog scene, some have pointed out the fact that Mao Mao closed her eyes in the scene, and thus we can conclude that she did want the physical advances to proceed. Others have said that if she wanted, she could have just said no, and that Jinshi, based on the evidence we have, might very well have stopped. We can't know this with certainty, but for a moment, let's do what we've done with Jinshi for much of the discussion and look at the evidence. Mao Mao reminds us constantly that she is nothing but a lowly servant. She often doesn't want to get involved in things because, as she puts it, she wants to keep her head attached to her neck for as long as possible. From the very beginning, she keeps hidden her ability to read and write, even though it would make her time at the rear palace better, because she's that determined to keep her head down, not attract attention, and stay out of trouble. So while it's possible Mao Mao might at the very least be curious about physical intimacy with Jinshi, we can't really begin to approach this without considering that she'd very likely be going along with what he wants simply because he's not only her superior, and her direct employer for large portions of her time at the palace, but he's also one of the most important people in the entire country. If the most respected concubines can't say no to the emperor, then why would Mao Mao ever think that she could say no to Jinshi? We also have seen Mao Mao often struggle to communicate how she feels as is. Even if she wanted to say no, she might not really understand how to express that, and given the status aspects of all of it, it'd be nearly impossible for her to disentangle. The solution is not, at least in my opinion, to decide that there's nothing that can be done and that we just need to accept that this is based on a historical setting, this is just how things are, and so on. I think it's actually possible to both want these characters to have a relationship with one another and for them to do this in a way that is healthy. The tough part is, and the brilliance of this story lies in how we accomplish that. My prediction for what's to come and how we see Jinshi grow into a better character despite his environment comes from two scenes toward the end of the second season, both pertaining to Mao Mao's kidnapping. While they involve different people, they're essentially the same situation. Jinshi, overcome with emotion and anger, threateningly approaches one of Lulan's ladies in waiting, as well as Shen Lu, the older woman who's been trapped in the palace. In both instances, we can understand the emotions Jinshi has. He's angry, confused, and scared at Mao Mao's disappearance. He wants answers, and in his efforts to get them, he crosses lines, ultimately terrifying both women. Of course, in the case of Shen Lu, she's even more terrified given the trauma she endured at the hands of the previous emperor. It's one of the most heartbreaking moments of the entire story, of course for Shen Lu, because of all the horrible things she's had to go through, as well as for Jinshi, because for him, he's realizing he has similarities to someone he considered a monster. He seems in shock, in fact, at seeing what lengths the woman would go to just to escape the pain she's experiencing. The moment is devastating, but also gives us some insight into the kind of person Jinshi wants to be. He doesn't want to cause harm, he doesn't want to hurt anyone, and he doesn't seem to take pleasure in the power he holds over people. Thus, as he continues to pursue Mao Mao, he will inevitably do things that I think all of us should be okay admitting are indeed crossing lines, but that we can also recognize might result in things he actually doesn't want. This could occur through realizing Mao Mao never reciprocates through want. Already, Jinshi doesn't like when Mao Mao only talks to him because she feels like she has to. He wants her to want to talk to him. So if she, quote-unquote, allows for things to happen without protest, but seems completely disinterested, it could very well result in him asking what would make her interested. Given how physically forward he's been before, both in the scene in the cave as well as through him biting her, he might do something far more forward and, truthfully, far more uncomfortable. In an almost juvenile way, he seems to enjoy getting a reaction out of Mao Mao, and he could very easily do something he thinks falls in line with that, and that in his mind he sees as playful, but that turns out to be anything but. If Mao Mao reacts, it might register to him, much as it did with Shen Lu and Lulan's lady in waiting, that he and Mao Mao are not on the same page. I personally don't see things continuing as they are without there being some kind of breaking point. It would be completely outside the established complexities of the show for Jinshi to suddenly just develop an understanding of enthusiastic consent, and it would be completely outside Mao Mao's character to sit down and have a long and open dialogue with him about what is and is not okay to do. It also would not be within reason to expect Jinshi to suddenly want to topple the entire concubine ecosystem, if you will, and to do away with every patriarchal aspect of their nation. To reiterate the point made at the beginning of the discussion, this does not mean that anyone should feel trapped within a black and white outlook about this topic. We can hold both a hope for Jinshi to become better and an understanding of why he's where he currently is. We can want him and Mao Mao to reach a point where they can truly be forthcoming and honest with one another, while recognizing that in order for that to happen, they'll have to go through a lot more together. And most importantly, we can hope that if change is possible, then maybe in the same way we've seen Jinshi use his position of power and privilege to see people protected and young women educated, he'll want to enact change in other areas as well. These are the kinds of things not only a great historical story illustrates for us, but what a great story in general illustrates. We see some of ourselves in the characters we love, and even in the characters we hate, but there's a huge divide between where we are now as a society and where they are. How that divide is bridged, and how we take the groundwork laid out in the development of that and apply it to our own lives moving forward, is how we truly reflect on the past in order to change the future. Currently, I've just started my read of the light novels, and I'm looking forward to discovering more of how the author dives into these sorts of topics. Let me know if there are other components to this story and these characters you'd like to dissect, and as we get more into the world, I'd be happy to reassess and challenge what we've talked about here. And on that note, let me know your thoughts on Apothecary Diaries. If you're ahead, be mindful of spoilers, and if you're wanting more content like this, I'll have my Apothecary Diaries playlist linked. Thanks so much for watching, have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.